So, first of all, thanks for being here, everybody. It's awesome on this beautiful, almost summer night at this point to see the room close to full. And I really appreciate that you came out to hear from me and our guests and about my book, The Fight for 15, The Right Wage for a Working America. You know, I'm not personally going to give a big political speech tonight, but this is quite the interesting political season, wouldn't you say? Because in terms of things that one never thought possible, some of those things we seem to be witnessing right before our eyes on the evening news. So in that spirit, I think I want to just ask us to get into a collective time machine and imagine that it was 40 years ago. And the year was 1976. And two men are running for president. A Democrat from Georgia, they used to have such things, a Republican from Michigan. And what if one of them had given a speech that predicted the future? I mean, imagine someone saying, "My fellow Americans, this difficult decade will soon be over. The embarrassment and humiliation and pain caused by the Vietnam War will eventually recede into memory. We're going to see no more lines for gasoline, no more stagflation, the double-digit inflation and unemployment. We're going to actually see the Berlin Wall crumble. The Cold War will end. We're going to see an era of no more foreign military threats to our soil. We're going to see the last of the formal legal barriers to full economic participation by women and people of color in this country fall. We're going to welcome China, Brazil, South Korea, and Russia, and South Africa into the global community of nations. And together they will lift hundreds of millions of people out of life-threatening poverty. Americans will invent or reinvent industries that will, in the next 30 years, create more wealth than has been created in all of humankind up to now. Technology will dramatically improve the lives of most people around the globe and all Americans, and we are going to continue to be the wealthiest nation on earth with the most productive workers. Well, giving that optimistic speech in 1976 would have seemed a pretty far cry from the reality of that moment. But then can you imagine what if the speech went on to say this? You know, all that wealth we're going to create, we're going to give 95% of it to the top 1% of income earners. We're going to give the rest of we're going to give 5% of it to the top 10% of income earners. We're going to ask the bottom 90% to take a 40-year wage freeze, and we're going to ask the bottom 50% to take a pay cut. We are going to export manufacturing, import third world wages. We're going to divest from our infrastructure. We're going to detax, deregulate, globalize, and privatize. We're going to break the unions, get rid of pensions in the private sector. We're going to make debt-free college education a thing of the past. We're going to shred the funding for urban and rural public schools. We're going to turn our backs on the middle class. We're going to replace old Jim Crow laws with a new economic apartheid for black and brown Americans. And we're going to tell the family that today needs only a single income to live a normal middle-class life, that they're going to need at least 3 such incomes to live the same lifestyle a generation from now, and the net impact of women doubling their workforce participation between 1977 and 2012 will be $0 in take-home pay for the bottom 90% of income-earning families. Now, obviously, anyone giving that speech would not have been elected. His political party probably would have been out of power for years. In fact, if a Soviet politician had given that speech, we probably would have sent some sort of battleship into the Baltic Sea for maneuvers just to send a message. But that's actually the reality we got over the last 40 years. And it wasn't one person's fault. It wasn't the weather. It was because we believed the wrong theories. We followed the wrong leaders. And through the malice and negligence of leaders of both political parties, we ended up with that reality today. Now, one of the big themes of my book, which if you've even cracked it open, you'll notice, is obviously I talk about the fight for 15 and the need for $15 wages in America. But really there are 2 other stories at work here. One is the arc of work and workers in America. The other is taken from the Occupy moment, this idea that it wasn't always this way and it doesn't have to be this way. Let's talk about the arc of work and workers, arc of history for work and workers in America. You know, we were hardly a nation born into perfection. At the dawn of the Republic, we had slavery, we had smallpox, we had short life expectancies, and we had suffrage restricted only to property-owning white men. But we also had embedded into the founding documents of the country this dream of liberty and justice for all. And for 200 years, always through incredible struggle, people in this country won more liberty and more justice for more people with each passing generation. It wasn't a force of nature. It wasn't, depending on your religious beliefs, something that nature did for us or God did for us. It's something that we did with the tools that we have. And we followed that American dream over the oceans. We followed it up the Underground Railroad. We followed it onto farms to the west, through the Civil War, through eras of robber barons and cartels, tenement slums, through union picket lines, through struggles for voting rights, through world wars, Cold War, wars, and depressions, through the civil rights movement, the second women's rights movement, the beginning of the Chicano rights movement, the LGBT rights movement, the Native American movement, or the American Indian movement, and now, today, through still new struggles for justice and liberation for oppressed people. The arc of Martin Luther King was right. The arc of history was, in fact, long, but it did indeed bend towards justice. At least that was a reasonable hypothesis up until sometime in the 1970s. I like to think about my own family and the fact that all of my grandparents or great-grandparents at some point were poor. And what lifted them out of poverty was not a Horatio Alger-like up by the bootstraps, mythic American story of libertarianism and hard work, devoid of any intervention from the government or civil society. What it actually was a vast conspiracy for good, right? That between government and labor and business, and always with a huge amount of struggle, people who were immigrants living in poverty or the descendants of immigrants, born onto farms with 10 siblings, many of whom went to work by the time they were in 8th grade, managed to retire as proud members of the middle class, who owned homes, who owned cars, who sent their kids to school, who could take time for their church or their community, for politics, for engaging in civic life, right? It was, in fact, the classic American dream, right? Today's workers are no less hardworking than the workers of my grandparents' generation, but they have a lot less going for them. When my grandparents were young workers, they had unions. They had a federal government broadly committed to increasing the shared prosperity in this country. And we had a general civic ethic of all boats rising together. Today, by contrast, and actually let me pause and just say that, think about where we were in the middle of the last century, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. By 1980, Americans at every level, except for the top 5th percentile, had the highest incomes in the world. We had the largest middle class in the world. We had a historic low poverty rate. We had the share of income going to the top 1% at its historic lowest, the share of income going to the middle class at its historic highest. We were far more educated than Europe. We had far more class mobility than in many countries around the world. I grew up believing we were number one. Now today, of course, the American middle class is number 27, if you measure it using actual math. We have the 27th largest middle class in the world. Germany has the first. Now, Germany is an interesting example, as I point out in the book, of a country where wages are high, taxes are high, social policy provides a really high safety net for everybody. German auto workers make twice what American auto workers make, and they sell twice as many cars. I had a chance to visit in January with some I was part of a group of U.S. labor leaders that brought fast food workers from the U.S. to visit with their counterparts in Europe. And it was really surprising for workers at McDonald's and Starbucks in the U.S. to realize that their German counterparts got to actually have works councils where they co-determined the workplace with management. And for McDonald's workers in the US to meet McDonald's workers in Denmark making $21 an hour. Now, of course, McDonald's isn't a stupid company. And as the head of not the food service union, but rather the food employer association said in Denmark, well, McDonald's wouldn't be here if they couldn't make money. We just have to do things a little bit differently. So here's what I talk about in the book. I really talk about it at the beginning, this story of the creation, sort of the rise and fall of the great American middle class, and the fact that today the top 1% own 42% of all household wealth, the fact that 400 families hold more wealth than half the rest of us combined. We have the widest wealth gap on record, the widest income gap since right before the first Depression. As Thomas Piketty said, wealth is so concentrated that a large segment of society is virtually unaware of its existence. It's so far up in the stratosphere, it's like standing at the foot of Mount Rainier hoping to see the peak. Now, as many Americans were asked to tighten their belts, CEO pay increased from 1977 to 2013, 937%. This is when wages were flatlining. For the rest of us, we all know that the stock market, has and some days continues to hit new highs. And if median household income had kept pace with productivity since the early 70s, it would now be $92,000 instead of $50,000. Now, this is a bleak enough picture if you think about it, but it gets a little scarier still. If you look at the signals from the future of work, the things that are now happening on the periphery, but that may someday become the new normal, you see a rise of part-time, contingent, unbenefited, on-demand employment, right? Right now, none of this is some of it, we all blame certain well-known smartphone apps for some of this, but in fact, it's been going on since almost the middle of the last century. 1950 was when the United Automobile Workers signed the Treaty of Detroit and assigned pension and health responsibilities to employers for the first time. And it was only 4 years later that a brilliant blender salesman named Ray Kroc bought out his largest customer, the McDonald's brothers hamburger stand in San Bernardino, and imported a business concept from the sewing machine industry that ended up centralizing profit, isolating risk, and consigning workers to a lifetime of permanent poverty. In the 1960s, we had Kelly Girl, the name of an actual company, that advertised that your new worker would never get sick, never chip a tooth, never slip a disc, never have a migraine, at least not on your dime. That's a quote. Then in the 70s, we saw the beginning of domestic and foreign outsourcing, and now we can all just order up any labor we want on our computer screen or our app. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. Technology marches on, business models march on, but if you look at what I say, and sort of as I chart sort of a look into the future at Chapter 2, if you take the sum total of franchising, temping, outsourcing, contracting out, offshoring, do not compete agreements, even for sandwich makers at Jimmy John's, the on-demand economy, the rise of the 1099 employment, what it all adds up to is a fissuring of the workplace, where the person you're actually reporting to is unlikely to be the person who's actually paying you, and whether the veil of who is the real employer, for how long am I employed, and who is responsible for how I'm being treated on the job is becoming an increasingly more complex and opaque proposition. So the first part of the book, I sort of trace the history of what's happened up to now. In the second chapter, I really talk about what's about to happen and what's already happening in isolated pockets here and there, including a very real debate right now about whether work will be replaced by machines. And there are actually two very different viewpoints of this that we don't have, the data's not yet in, but there are really smart people who believe that this time is different, that the marching forward of Moore's law, the doubling of technological capacity every 18 to 24 months, will in fact prove what we all used to call the Luddite fallacy itself a fallacy, that eventually we're going to see a decline in the amount of work humans can do as it's replaced by machines. And we think about the fact that Watson, the IBM supercomputer, is now better at diagnosing cancer than the average New York City oncologist, right? Think about that, right? And yesterday or the day before, we saw robot surgeons operating now more precisely than human surgeons. So it's no longer just factory workers who potentially face the risk of technological and disruptive technological unemployment. It could be the rest of us too. That's the depressing part of the book. Of course, if we end up without a need for jobs, when we'll be incredibly wealthy, we'll just have the mother of all wealth distribution problems. But then I start to talk about the good news. And starting in chapter 3, really start to talk about the hidden history of worker struggle over the last 20 years. And the fact that while the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Fox News and Washington Post, liberal and conservative, were all ready to write the tombstone inscription for the American labor movement, there have actually been a number of really inspiring, really innovative worker-led campaigns in a number of sectors that I'm not going to predict yet have answered the question of what future forms of worker power are going to look like, but there are some incredibly interesting experiments. I got to visit with a group called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. What's Immokalee? It's the name of a county in central Florida where about 50% of all U.S. tomatoes are harvested between December and May of each year. This is a place where there were slaves in the 21st century, where as recently as 15 years ago, the federal government was prosecuting growers for enslaving undocumented immigrants, having them live in canisters, right, confiscating their passports and their paychecks. In Florida. Today, Walmart actually began paying its tomato pickers $10 an hour before they began paying their own store associates $10 an hour, because this, not a union, but a human rights organization called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, figured out a way to use the power of consumer demand in the marketplace to cause the biggest retailer in the world, Walmart, as well as a whole host of other grocery stores and fast food stores and restaurant chains, to only buy tomatoes with a fair food label on them. And that you can only get the fair food label if you're a grower, if you pay the workers' organization to come onto your site, teach your workers what their rights are, and then give them the ability to certify that you're operating an ethical workplace. Right? Now, $10 an hour is not a luxurious wage anywhere, not even in central South Florida, but for an industry to go from slavery as the norm to $10 an hour and a worker organization as the norm in the space of 15 years is incredible progress. I talk in the book about a number of other interesting, what we call alt-labor experiments, these alternative labor models that aren't unions, but that are trying with often no legal tools at their disposal, but just energy and creativity, to address a lot of the what are called excluded workers, people who were never protected by labor and employment laws to begin with. And sort of towards the end, among those, are a lot of really scrappy, interesting worker centers. There are alternative political parties like the Working Families Party in New York. There are sort of community think tanks. I highlight the work of Lane in Los Angeles, but also here in Seattle, Puget Sound Sage. There are old school union campaigns using new techniques like our home care organizing or Justice for Janitors in SEIU. And then, sometimes there are uprisings that are quite unexpected. I think no one saw Occupy coming. Probably no one really saw the Battle of Seattle coming in 1999. And I don't think many people would have predicted that, when Obama was reelected in 2012, and I was at a meeting with a number of other labor leaders with a high-level White House official who said, we could never think about going to $9. It might hurt the economic recovery. How fast 18 million American workers would be going to some version of $15, which is now what's happened. And that's where we start to talk about what's happened here locally, in Sea-Tac and in Seattle. And I'm not going to get into all of the details. Many of you read every newspaper article and watched every TV news report as those things were going on. But these were incredible campaigns happening in our city, in our region, and in our media market within living memory, right, that many people here in this room were very much a part of. And it's funny because they were both campaigns for $15. They were both campaigns largely underwritten and sponsored by the same groups of organizational and individual leaders, but they were very different campaigns. In Sea-Tac, we had this living wage law designed specifically for hospitality and transportation and aerospace employers of a certain size. And I think it would not be too, others who are going to be up on stage later can argue about this. I think it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say it was pretty much like class war, right? The bosses wanted the state minimum wage, the workers wanted $15. If you look at the way the electorate divided in that city, there were sharp class lines, sharp race lines, sharp lines about neighborhood, about home ownership. And it was essentially a tug of war over a binary outcome. It was either 15 or not on the ballot in 2013. Now that came about because of years of outsourcing and impoverishment of work in the airline industry. Workers who used to be middle class making $60,000 a year with pensions and health benefits, a generation later making minimum wage with no benefits at all. And in the book I talk about workers who were honorably discharged US Marines who then ended up in minimum wage jobs and then commuting 80 miles home because that's where they could afford to live. I talk about a Ukrainian immigrant woman who's a cabin cleaner at Sea-Tac who, because she couldn't afford to buy into her company's health plan, would actually fly home to the Ukraine every time she needed to see a doctor. And when those workers were frustrated by 3 years of failed union organizing under an archaic law called the Railway Labor Act, which would have required them to unionize all the workers in Honolulu and Portland, Maine at the same time, if they wanted to get a union, they instead decided they were going to write labor standards into the city law in Sea-Tac and put not only $15, but sick leave, full-time work, prohibition on employers stealing tips, and private enforcement mechanisms up for a vote of the people that famously passed after a recount by only 77 votes. About as narrow of a victory as one could possibly find. Happened for a number of reasons. First of all, we changed the debate. We actually weren't willing to let the business and right-wing forces in Sea-Tac concede this was a job killer. We actually said the opposite. It's not a job killer. It's going to create jobs. Because when people at the airport get paid and they get off work, guess what they're going to do? They're actually going to stop in for a beer or take home a pizza. They're going to want somewhere to buy groceries, which right now you can't do in most of Sea-Tac, where there aren't any major grocery stores. Maybe the video store that now has become a pawn shop will then turn into something better. And maybe the grocery store that became a Goodwill will become a grocery store again. And we really appealed to a lot of the older voters in Sea-Tac by a memory of what their community had been when those jobs were good jobs. At the same time that we had to change the electorate by by increasing by about 10 to 15% the number of registered voters and then knocking on 10,000 doors 40,000 times in 3 weeks leading up to the election. Those of us who have done union organizing campaigns will know the principle that if someone isn't wearing the union button to work, they are not a yes vote. Is this familiar to anyone in the room? Like if someone's not willing to put their name on a petition that's going to be public, then you could pretty much count on that person's not really with you. So we applied the same principle in Sea-Tac. We said, unless we see you put a sign in your yard or a sticker in your window, you're not a yes vote. And it was through that sort of hard assessment style organizing that we ended up beating out the other side by 77 votes. Up the street in Seattle, things were a little bit different. Because at the end of the day in Seattle, we didn't end up going to war. We actually ended up with a negotiated peace. And through a process that many, many people have the right to take credit for, including many people in this room, we ended up with a Income Inequality Advisory Committee that on a 21 to, not unanimous, but on a 21-3 vote recommended a minimum wage policy, a unanimous vote of the city council, and then a signature by the mayor, who had campaigned in his own election for a phased-in $15 wage. So a lot of what I talk about in those two chapters of the book is really the study in contrasts, about how, whereas in Sea-Tac it was really about workers uniting with community and making demands on companies and then never being willing to say no, even when they were foiled again and again through union organizing efforts or in courts of law. In Seattle, it was a different story where we needed an organizing and demanding left. We needed workers in motion in the street, but we also had the government operating openly on the side of the workers, saying it's not if, but how we get to $15. And we had a business community that was willing to come to the table and negotiate. And to say, how can we make this work for everybody instead of a binary outcome like we ended up with in Sea-Tac? And so although they took place at the same time, same space, these were really remarkably different campaigns. And then towards the end of the book, what I do is really talk about why 15 is good for our economy. Not not only will $15 bring more workers out of poverty, it will actually also bring more customers to businesses. Not only will it mean more kids can stay in school because they can afford the tuition, it also actually means early childhood brains will develop faster. We can now say with some certainty about poverty that parental poverty is the most important determinant of children's success in school. And so whether you look at housing, whether you look at hunger, whether you look at education, whether you look at spending power, by any metric possible, a $15 wage policy is actually good for all of us. And then in Chapter 7, we tell the story about how the sky will not fall. Now this is some funny stuff, because in 1913, the head of the department store trade association predicted that if Congress passed a law prohibiting children under the age of 16 from working more than 8 hours a day, that the department store industry would go bankrupt. It was in 1913. Now, perhaps perhaps the department store industry will still go bankrupt 103 years later, but it'll have far more to do with technology e-commerce giants headquartered down the street than it will do with any law prohibiting 14-year-olds from working 9 or 10 hours a day. In 1937, when Congress was considering its first true minimum wage law, the head of the American Publishers Association, who apparently was a terrible student of history, predicted that America will fall like ancient Rome if we imposed a minimum wage standard on private industry. Because according to his version of history, it was not overextension of empire that defeated ancient Rome. It was actually when the government got in the business of dictating prices to the private sector. I missed that in my classical history growing up. So what this all adds up to is really a story about how we're really in charge. Right? For 40 years, we've been told a lie, which is that the economy works like the weather, that it's like gravity. Unless there's something coming down, you're not going to get anything. Right? And the only way we can possibly build prosperity is to heap lots of goodies like tax breaks and lack of regulations on the extremely rich and on corporations. If an honest conservative truly believed that in 1975, we now have a 40-year laboratory experiment about whether that's true. We got rid of the unions, we got rid of the pensions, we got rid of much of the regulations, we got rid of many layers of government, we destroyed a lot of old social programs, and yet somehow we're no longer number one, we're number 27 when it comes to the size of our middle class. Kind of the core thing here is what we did in Seattle is broadly applicable to everybody. Right? Workers who are inspired by a demand, who actually then are inspired enough to walk off the job, take to the streets, make demands on City Hall, make demands on employers, and help lead a movement, can actually get something done. And I remember a moment, the mayor was very kind in his introductory remarks, but I remember a moment not long after we passed the law here when he called and said, "I'm really worried. No other cities are doing this. It's just us in San Francisco." And I'll tell you, throughout writing the book, I had to keep revising what I was saying about Andrew Cuomo a lot. Because first he was like, oh, God bless them, they should shoot for the stars. Then he was like, well, yeah, we'll do this in fast food. Then he's like, well, we'll do it for state employees. Oh, wait, we'll just do it for everybody. And I couldn't quite keep up with Andrew Cuomo's evolution on this issue as the national opinion climate shifted so dramatically in such a short period of time. So here's the deal. America was not always a low-wage nation. And being a low-wage nation is a choice. My proposition is that we should make a different choice, and then in fact, it's up to us. And here's why. I always ask audiences if they can name the governor in 1915. Anyone here name the governor in 1915? Washington State, without looking at your smartphones. I thought so. I've asked this question to governors, and they also don't know the answer about their own states. I don't know who the most popular entertainer was in 1915. I don't know who the best-selling artist or author was in 1915. I know Woodrow Wilson was the president. I couldn't really name the failed Republican candidate in the 1916 election. But you know what we remember about that era? We remember the anti-sweatshop movement. We remember the movement for women's suffrage. Throughout our history, we are far more likely to remember the compelling social movements than we are even the people who led them, right? You know, we can remember one or two famous people who were abolitionists, Harriet Tubman maybe, and Frederick Douglass, but hundreds of thousands of people put their lives on the line to change a fundamental economic injustice in this country that related to work and workers, right? For every single moment along the way, the progressive movement, the anti-sweatshop movement, suffrage, civil rights, et cetera, we remember the great movements of those times. So sort of the core hypothesis here isn't just that we should have a $15 minimum wage. Of course we should. Many places should probably actually be higher if we really wanted to account for what it really costs to live in some of these expensive cities. The real hypothesis here is that 100 years from now, no one's going to remember my name, no one's going to remember most of your names except for your own descendants. People will remember whether, when the American dream was at its greatest level of risk, a handful of brave people in the upper left corner of the country had the courage to do something about it. And I hope we give them lots of reasons to remember us with appreciation. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heidi. I'm a reporter at The Stranger, and I'm very excited that you're all here. We are going to bring up our panelists. I'm going to introduce them. They're each going to talk for a few minutes, and then we're going to go into Q&A. So if you guys just want to come up as I introduce you, we've got Howard Wright, who is the chairman and CEO of the Seattle Hospitality Group. His family owns the Space Needle, and he was co-chair of the Mayor's Minimum Wage Committee with David Rolf. We have Nick Hanauer, who is a venture capitalist who has called on his fellow rich people to try to support policies that are good for the middle class. He also founded a progressive think tank called Civic Ventures. Kshama Sawant is a member of the Socialist Alternative Party and a Seattle City Council member who ran for office promising to help fight for a $15 minimum wage in Seattle. And somewhere we have Martina Phelps, who was a McDonald's worker during the Fight for 15. She went on strike in May of 2014. So thank you, Martina. And I also want to remind everyone that you have cards to write questions on, and at some point near the end of this, someone will come and get those cards, and then David and the panelists will answer your questions. So we're going to start with Nick. Please talk a little bit more about this idea of middle-out economics and the role that has played in the Fight for 15.
Cool. Does this work? Yes. Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me. So here's the problem. So since the 60s, 70s, 80s, the percent of GDP devoted to corporate profits has doubled from about 6% to 12% of GDP. And at the same time, the share of income for the top 1% of Americans has grown from about 8% to, 22, 23% share. And if you add those numbers up, it's about 10, 11, 12% of GDP. It's in the range of $1.6, $1.7 trillion that used to be wages and is now either profits or wages for the top 1%. And that $1.8 trillion is the problem. I mean, that if you want to dimensionalize the problem, those are where the bucks are. And the great challenge is, despite the fact that I'm a very nice person, Howard's a very nice person, and many of the extremely wealthy people that we associate with are nice and progressive people, we have become accustomed to this new arrangement, and we are unlikely to want to be just like, hey, you can have it back. And so if we want to recast the economy in a way which more reasonably distributes the value created by enterprise, that will take what I think of as a supermajority of support, which is to say, if you want to, like that, you know, no, we're nice people, but let's be clear, there are some people who are not as nice as us who definitely do not want to change it back. And so if we want to affect this change in a nonviolent way, and I would prefer that myself, it will take a huge amount of public support to bend the political process to fix these problems. And to do that, you have to change minds. And you have to change them in a very, very profound way. And I want to zero in on just one dimension of that, which is, to quote one of my favorite people, former speaker John Boehner, who said, in the context of raising the minimum wage, I just want you to hear these words. If you raise the price of employment, guess what happens? You get less of it. Let me say that again. If you raise the price of employment, you get less of it. And what John was expressing, which many other people have expressed for a very long time, is that there is an inverse relationship between higher wages for workers and jobs. In fact, there was a Nobel Prize-winning economist named Buchanan that asserted that this was a law of nature. He literally put it was a scientific law that if wages went up, employment would go down. And, you know, trickle-down economics, which is roughly tax cuts for the rich, deregulation for the powerful, and wage suppression for everyone else, which is, you know, a belief system, a way of thinking about how the economy works that we have instantiated into policy and politics over time. You know, perhaps the core principle of trickle-down economics is this idea that a bunch of people, some by mistake and some purposefully, socialized over 30 or 40 years, which is if workers' wages went up, jobs would be killed, and so on and so forth. And so here's the really fascinating, here's the point I want to make. The fascinating part about that is how many people believe that, although we've made a dent, and the fight for 15 was largely about instantiating a fight over that, but how many people believe that, and how disconnected from reality that is. So there's an abundance of economic research which shows that there is basically almost no job loss effect, an indetectable job loss effect, and a zillion microeconomic studies when you raise wages, you know, nothing happens. And you know, so as you're looking at that, one of the things that you would want to do as a policymaker or as a citizen is say to yourself, okay, there are all these fancy microeconomic studies, but maybe we should just look back at the 22 times that we raised the minimum wage since 1938 and see what actually happened, right? You would do that, right? Except nobody ever did that until a few weeks ago when an economist who works for UNC actually went through all the wage data and the employment data by industry sector and looked at it, you know, for all 22 minimum wage increases and discovered, lo and behold, that in fact, in 68% of the cases, employment went up after the minimum wage increase. Why? Because when workers have more money, businesses have more customers and need more workers. There were cases when employment went down. 100% of those cases were when the economy was in recession. Right? So what a reasonable person can do is look at that data and go, I guess raising wages doesn't kill jobs. But here's the point, is that when somebody like me says to you, raising wages kills jobs, what I want you to realize, and what's super hard for people to realize and super hard for academic economists to realize, because they think it's like this search for truth, that's not a claim on physical reality. That's not a reflection of legitimate economics. It's a negotiating strategy. It is the oldest trick in the businessman's wage suppression handbook. You say you want more money, and I say, fine, except I would have to fire you, right? How many of you have had a wage negotiation like that, where you're like, I'd really like more money, and you're like, I would love to do it, but then I would have to fire you. So saying for the Chamber of Commerce, the nice people of the Chamber of Commerce to say, if you raise the price of employment, guess what happens? You get less of it, is just a way of negotiating wages at scale. It's just a very efficient way of negotiating wages. And so, the fight for 15 is largely about litigating that, killing that idea. Now, don't get me wrong. Like Howard and I will tell you, it is very inconvenient to raise wages for workers a lot. Like, it's not easy. We hate it. We prefer to avoid it. But as a society, we need to tease apart the difference between what's easy and convenient for capitalists narrowly and what's good for capitalism generally. And I think we can conclude that when everybody makes more money, eventually it's going to be good for us too. So thank you very much.
Kshama, I want to go to you next. We know that 15 does not happen with data and venture capitalists alone. So can you tell us how we got to 15, from a slogan on your campaign signs and maybe something a few workers were talking about to this huge movement in the streets and then actual legislation?
Thank you, everyone, for being here and for my fellow panelists, and especially congratulations to David, Rolf, on the publication of an important book. I also wanted to pay my respects to Cleve Stockmeyer, who passed away unexpectedly. For many of you who've been longtime activists in Seattle, you would know that he was himself a dedicated activist. And I mention him especially not only because he unexpectedly passed on last week, but also because he was the attorney for us who filed the 15 Now ballot initiative, which is very much part of the narrative, which big business will not mention, but it's important for us who are fighting for workers and as workers ourselves to recognize how 15 was won. And as Heidi said, it's important for workers and working class people and activists on the left not only to win these reforms, which are absolutely necessary because they make a tangible difference in real people's lives, and for that reason alone it is worth fighting for, but it is important also for us to make sure that we have control on the history, on the narrative, because it makes a difference when we win something if the correct story is told, how we won it, because if we know that we won it through our work, through our energies, through the fact that we had the courage to build a movement that defied the power of big business and the entrenched positions of elected officials at many levels who have for decades been bought out by corporations but have been challenged now by working people. If we can hold on to that narrative, and a true narrative, then it sets us up to possibly win other victories, which I think is extremely important. For many workers who have started experiencing the benefit of an increasing wage in Seattle, I know they are already not able to hold on to a foothold of a basic standard of living in Seattle because rents are also skyrocketing. So 15 is hardly the end of the battle, and of course, as a socialist, I would say that is only the very beginning of what we are started to win. But I just wanted to just quickly give everyone a sense, I know everybody knows this, but just give everyone a sense of how far we have come and the implications, the historical implications of what we have been able to achieve in Sea-Tac and Seattle. We started here, and I have a list of cities, and this is an incomplete list because this is a publication from several months ago, just to read the cities that have won increases in minimum wages since we won here. And they're not all $15 an hour, but I think any increase is absolutely important. Emeryville, California, Los Angeles, California, Portland, Maine, Kansas City, Missouri, Birmingham, Alabama, St. Louis, Missouri, Palo Alto, California, Johnson County, Indiana, Los Angeles County, California, Mountain View, California, Sacramento, California, Lexington, Kentucky, Tacoma, Washington, Bangor, Maine, El Cerrito, California, Santa Clara, California, Olympia, Washington, which is now currently being proposed, Davis, California, Sacramento, California, Washington, D.C. I mean, the list goes on. I don't have enough time to finish the list and make the other points that I want to make. But I think that is a powerful illustration of the latent the position that workers can assume if we only know that that's the kind of power we have. And I also might say that look at the impact we've had, that $15 an hour has been a big issue in the presidential campaign on the Democratic side. And at the New York State debate, I was watching it live, Hillary said she had always supported Seattle's 15, which was news to me, by the way, because I was there and she did not. So, but my point is that the most long-term advocates and spokespeople of corporations are having to bend to the fact that the entire nation is saying $15 an hour is the wage and nothing less. And that's very important. But I also think, as I said before, it's important to understand the history and also have control over the history of how it was won. I know that a lot of people are talking about how big business helped us win. We all came to the table, the Income Inequality Advisory Committee, which of course was an important location and forum where these discussions happened. But I would like to say, just for the record of our history, that that is not how gains are achieved, and that is not how this particular gain was achieved. And I know the mayor said in his recent, in the video here, and he said this before, and it's not just him, a lot of people say this, a lot of corporate politicians say this, well, you know, we win victories when we come together with our common goals. But that is not true. If it was the goal of big business to give us a living wage, then what stopped them? Why was 2014 the golden year? Why didn't they do it before? And Howard Schultz, just to quote one person, the CEO of Starbucks, he even admitted, in a rare moment of honesty, admitted that his company could afford to pay for $15 an hour for his employees, but he didn't say, okay, now I'm going to 15. No, we had to fight for it, and the only reason we won it was because the balance of forces between the power of big business and the power of working people and labor movements shifted in a way that favored us for a change. And for those people who say, and I know the mayor himself has said this, but he's not the only one who said, well, you know, we were trying to avoid class warfare. And my response to that always is, well, guess what? It is class warfare. And to quote Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote the really well-known book Nickel and Dimed, where she worked as a low-wage worker, to write a report on that, she said that, yes, it is class warfare. It is always class warfare under capitalism. The only difference is that so far it has been aerial bombardment on working people, and only now we are starting to reverse. And it's absolutely correct that we are fighting to reverse it. And I also say, and I'm running out of time, so I should stop soon, but I just also want to say that it is tempting. I know. I am compassionate to the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there are enough rich people in the world that they want to do the right thing and then we can all have a utopia. It's tempting to believe that. I know it's not true. I know it's not true. It is tempting to believe that, but it is absolutely necessary. It's imperative for us if we are to keep building our movement and winning further victories, and not just 15, not just single-payer healthcare, but really fundamental shift away from racism, sexism, really having equal pay for equal work. If we are to win all of this, then it is imperative that we understand that nothing was ever won and nothing ever will be won by the largesse of the powers that be in a deeply unequal society. It is only won if we fight, if we who are at various degrees of the bottom, we get together in solidarity and we demand that this is our right and this is the only vision for a just society. And for those who may feel that this economy can't survive if the most poverty-stricken workers are paid a little more, I would say, well, then this economy is indefensible if that was indeed true. But Nick is absolutely right. Economic evidence, and I'm an economist, it shows very, very systematically that there are no detrimental impacts. But it is also important to understand that big business does not oppose reforms like 15 because they actually are stupid enough to think that it will become an apocalyptic scenario. They're smart. They understand. What they are doing, though, is rational on their part, because if they relent and gave us a concession on one reform, we're not going to stop there. We're going to come for more. And that is absolutely correct of them to understand, but we also have to understand, consequently, that that means that we have to win whatever we can win today, set the narrative straight, take control of our history, and keep building this movement forward, because we have so much more work to do. We need to keep building this movement forward.
All right, Howard, you're next. What do you think about that? And what did it take to get you to support 15, you and your fellow businessmen?
I guess this is on. I feel like the kid who didn't bring his homework. These two are very well spoken, and I'm sure our third panelist is as well. Couple things. One was sort of a reality perspective, and one was a personal perspective. So the reality perspective was that I said to many of my colleagues, both within my own working environment and also at a broader sort of Chamber of Commerce and peer, colleague environment, if you don't think this is coming to Seattle, it is. And I don't have any evidence, I can't anything empirical, but I just have this sense that it's coming to Seattle, and if it's coming to Seattle, I think that we should get in front of it and do it right. And I realize some people disagree with me about the perspective that we took about collaboration, but that I felt very strongly about. From a global perspective, I just felt that the thing that I am most proud about as an American is our middle class. I think it's the strongest asset that we have going for us, and I saw it fraying, and I didn't want to see that happen. And I wanted to make any contribution that I could to help stabilize that. And that's what brought me to the table on this.
All right, Martina, tell us what it was like to walk off the job.
Hi, everybody. That was an experience of a lifetime. I felt like it was, I said, there's nothing else that I can do that can out-top this. Walking out on managers, bringing out my whole crew, bringing out the whole entire staff. And feeling like there's absolutely nothing else that they can stop us from doing. If we put our mind to it and, put God in it, and He'll bring us out. And that was just the best feeling of a lifetime. And I would do it again if I had to.
You can, if you want to.
So I've been involved in the Fight for 15 when they first brought it to Seattle. And when they first brought it to me, I said, no hesitation, I'm in. I said, we deserve, after seeing my coworkers and people that are like just going to random places and seeing how low-wage workers are literally struggling and not having enough food to take care of their children, not having enough money to buy their children stuff for Christmas. And I'm just like, it set in my mind, I was like, I can do something about this. I know I'm a strong individual, and I'm really down for anything. And I said, this is something down my line, like, and it runs in my family. I get it. My mom was an activist with, somebody help me out. It was like women's rights with the state. I forgot what it was, but I'll remind you later. But I really, and when I first started getting involved with the Fight for 15 in Seattle, my mom was just like, girl, go do it. Go do what you have to do. And that's where, between my mom and this lady to my right, she's, to my left, she's one of my sheroes. And so once I met Kshama Sawant and Patty Murray, it was like, okay, I'm really doing this. I'm really involved. And to actually win, and I never thought that we weren't going to win. I said at the beginning, we are going to get this. They are going to give this to us. And we might have to fight just a little bit, but they're going to give this to us just because I think they know that this is something that we really do need. And Seattle is so expensive. I was like, they know we need this. And without a doubt, and believing in the city council members and going to Olympia and speaking with the governor and different representatives, I said, I think they get the picture, they get the point that we really do need this. And my involvement has been very adventurous and exciting, and I can't wait to what's come next, statewide, around the country. I can't wait. Thank you, guys.
So I have a couple of questions, but before I do that, I think someone's going to come around and collect the cards from... Okay, that's done. Great. Okay. But first, I want to ask one of my questions, which is that 15 is great, and it's really exciting that we've started this movement from Seattle that's spread across the rest of the country, but still surveys show that a lot of workers don't know their rights, and that a lot of them aren't being paid what they're owed. And now we have to have the discussion of who should pay for better enforcement of these laws. So Kshama and Howard in particular, I want to hear what you think about who should fund better enforcement of 15 and other labor laws.
Well, the Office of Labor Standards for the City of Seattle should.
And who should pay? Who should pay for more investigators for the Office of Labor Standards?
Well, my position is that it should come out of the city budget, and there is one proposal for increased license fees for businesses and an increase in the B&O tax, and that is a position that I would support.
So you would support businesses paying more for better enforcement?
Via those methods.
Okay. Kshama, what do you think?
Well, the labor movement has put forward the penny per hour and the license fee and B&O, business and occupation, in other words, are two of the very, very few mechanisms that are at the city's disposal to raise revenues, beyond what is usually raised in the city. And that is fundamentally, that's the problem we face, that our hands are so tied by the fact that the state legislature has acted over the years to really gravely limit our possibilities, and these are some options, and I really think that these should be taken. And city council members the elected officials in City Hall today should actually be pushing for it. I'm definitely completely in solidarity with the labor movement in pushing for this. And we've seen evidence not only from Seattle, we have a huge amount of anecdotal evidence from Seattle, but we have statistical evidence from other cities which show that unless the labor laws are enforced, in other words, unless the city the municipality explicitly spends money on carrying out enforcement, and there are various mechanisms, we have a lot of history to go by from other cities to show which ones work and which ones don't work that well. We have a lot of expertise to do that, but we need funding for that, and it is shown over and over again that unless you have an explicit funding source for upholding labor law, it's not really much use passing labor law. As we all know, in Seattle, for example, wage theft and violation of paid sick and safe leave is pretty rampant, and so we should expect that the $15 law also will have problems in enforcement, and so we absolutely need to do that. And I think it's only fair that business pays for this, because we live in the state with the most regressive tax system in the entire nation, and this is a very small thing we're talking about. I'm sure everybody saw what came out in the news recently, that Microsoft really made a record of sorts. It made $1 trillion in revenues, and there was a really interesting posting from an ex-Microsoft employee who's become a Microsoft watchdog, who said, well, you would think that a company that successful would shout it off the rooftops, we made $1 trillion in revenues, but the reason they're not shouting off the rooftops is because very nearly half of those revenues the Washington state cannot tax because they are stored in offshore havens. So we're talking about fighting deep inequality, and this is a very, very small measure we're talking about.
And if I could just, I don't know if this is on or not, But Nick and I totally support the enforcement of it, because if we're going to be good employers, we want everybody to be a good employer. And if we're going to play by the rules of the road, it should be an even playing field. And so we fully support the enforcement of it.
Just very quickly, there are good businesses, meaning businesses that actually don't flout the law, do follow the law and make effort to follow the law. And some businesses who are, we knew some of the businesses already were paying $15 an hour before and the law hasn't come fully into effect. But I'd like to quote Sarah Cherin, who heads up UFCW, who says often that we want citywide policies because we don't want workers to depend on the boss lottery, on drawing the boss lottery. And if most businesses aren't complying with the law, then we need enforcement. And if most businesses aren't following good practices, then we need laws to change them into good practices.
So I'm going to go to your questions now. David, do you want to come back up and join us? And so I'm just going to throw the question out there, and you can decide who answers it. What role can the leaders who brought 15 to Seattle play in continuing to support workers who are organizing and fighting for higher standards and better lives? Do you want to start?
If I have a mic, I can
Oh, yes.
Please take mine.
So listen, I think that Seattle has a particular role to play here, right? There are a small relative, so if you look at the current political map of the country, most states are currently under control of anti-worker governors and or anti-worker legislatures. And even in some relatively progressive states, there are in some cases old laws that prevent cities from experimenting on a municipal basis with improved labor standards or improved enforcement mechanisms. New York, the mayor of New York would have gone to 15 several years before he was able to get his governor there. And if people were looking at the Oregon debate, Portland didn't have the freedom to experiment with the wage rate in Portland. They actually had to get the legislature in Salem to do that. So I think that for those of us who are fortunate enough to call Seattle home, I think part of what we have to accept is that we're called on to lead in this moment. And this year, 2 years ago it was the minimum wage. 2 years before that was paid sick leave. This year we're talking about enforcement and about fair scheduling. But I say this at the end of the book. There are lots of strategies for rebuilding the middle class in this country. Right? We should actually think about a shorter, easier to comply with employment contract combined with a longer, more robustly funded social contract and a number of policies that change the rules of how power operates, ranging from monetary policy at the federal level to campaign finance reform, which could take place at any number of levels. But I think that it's, between the dawn of the Republic and 1935, there was not just one labor movement. There wasn't just one model of worker power. There were actually competing experiments with how to improve workers' lives in America. And I think that now, as the old model of labor unionism fades, and the legacy social programs and laws of the Great Society and the New Deal are now further away from us than they in turn were from the Civil War, the moment is not for willing back last century's system. It's for inventing the next labor movement that can in turn give birth to the next American middle class. That will start in progressive cities like Seattle.
Anybody else want to? All right. To the wealthy panelists. When you express progressive ideas to a group of low-wage workers, is your audience skeptical simply due to your wealth? Is there a built-in barrier between labor and the wealthy no matter what you say, just because of who you are?
That's almost certainly true. But we all have different roles to play in building a better country and a better democracy. And my role is going to be, I think, very different and distinct from Kshama's. And I'm going to carry a different message in a different way to I think, in a certain sense, to a different audience. So I agree emphatically with Kshama about the need to own the narrative, because if you don't, people will draw the wrong conclusions, and the win that we have today, we will not be able to use as a way to win the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. But you know, what I, you know, sort of a broken record on, and what I talk about, and why it doesn't matter so much if workers are listening to me, is that I am continually talking about economic growth, because here's just a fact that only 1 in 3 people in the country will identify with these values and workers, right? Most people in the country are not low-wage workers, and most people in the country don't feel as strongly about fairness as the people on this panel, and I suspect many of the people in the audience. Most people in the country will not make a trade-off between fairness and their own narrow self-interest. And if you want to change the country, you must build a supermajority. You cannot build a movement with 1 in 3 workers. You need 1 in 3 voters. You need 2 in 3. And so we have to find a way to combine the energy that Kshama and others have channeled with the reasonable self-interest of a huge number of middle and upper middle class people, by getting people to see that when low-wage workers are better treated, it is better for everybody. It's better for everybody. It's better for them, it's better for businesses, it's better for taxpayers, and so on and so forth. And so, I believe that narrative is so important, because if we can win 15 by proving to people that it's good for the economy, then 2/3 or 3/4 of the people in this country will be with us on the next reform, and then the next reform, and then the next reform, because the fight over political economy largely is a fight over cause and effect. Is a thriving middle class the cause or consequence of growth? The trickle-down people will tell you that giving tax cuts to rich people creates a thriving middle class. That is wrong and backwards. A thriving middle class creates growth. And winning that fight is how you win again and again and again. And that's my message. So
I'll have what he's having, but to answer the question, I mean, those who know me know that I'm authentic. Those who don't know me may be skeptical. When we first started this Income Inequality Advisory Committee, the day that David, Rolf, and I met was actually on a stage like this when the mayor was announcing this committee. And afterwards, and I'd never met David before, afterwards I said, so if you have time in the next couple of days, maybe we could get together to have a cup of coffee. And being the gracious person that he is, he said, yeah, sure, but what's up? And I said, well, if we're going to co-chair this thing, we should get to know each other, and let's see if we have some common ground. So we did. So we got together a couple days later, and we had, I think we'd blocked out, 15, 20 minutes of courtesy, and I think we spent a couple hours together. And when he said to me, in order to have successful unions, we also need to have successful employers. And when he said that, I knew that we could work together and that we would get to yes on this. And he and I got to yes very early, and then we just followed the process for the end result. So.
All right. The next question. Is this presidential race going the way of the 2014 Seattle mayor's race, with candidates competing over who can do better on the minimum wage? Kshama?
Well, I think as far as the Democratic primary is concerned, I think it's absolutely true that what we are witnessing is a historic shift in consciousness. And that shift in consciousness is not because of Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders just happens to have captured that moment, and it was absolutely correct. It was principled of him to have called for a political revolution against the billionaire class. He needn't have done that. I needn't have run as a socialist in 2013 and called for 15 and taxing the rich and rent control. But the fact that we won proved us right, that we were capturing the moment where people are hungry for alternatives to corporate politics. And in a deeply cynical and disturbing way, Trump's ascendancy also represents a hunger for alternatives against corporate politics. And as a matter of fact, there was a recent poll that came out just 2 days ago that said that the #1 reason that people seem to be favoring Trump is because they want to send a message to Clinton and all the other representatives of the establishment. So in that sense, I think that it is what we're seeing this year in the presidential elections is a sign of what could be in the coming years. I mean, I say what could be because I think a real moment, a historic moment is opening up, and it's being reflected since the Occupy movement and actually globally since the Arab Spring. But I say it could be because it is not automatic. None of what we have done so far in winning $15 an hour, in fighting against the Seattle Housing Authority, in Seattle against the 400% rent hikes, none of what we've done, and the Cherry Point victory, by the way, the Lummi Nation that won a significant victory yesterday, none of this was won automatically. This was won because people on the ground are building movements. And I agree with David, there will be different tactics and strategies that our organized movements will need to use, and we will need to continue to be very alive to the situations and what it needs in terms of responses. But what the common denominator that runs through successful movements is the fact that we need to be courageous, and we need to never forget that, as Frederick Douglass said, power never does not concede anything without a demand. It never has and it never will. And so we're seeing a real moment, and we need to really seize that moment and not feel that, the biggest mistake we can make actually is falling behind the times and thinking that people aren't ready. I mean, to Nick's point about, what's the correlation between what's socially good and self-interest? The divergence between those two variables is very strong the richer you are. I mean, so for the multi-billionaire class, I think what's socially good is not coinciding with what's self-interested. But for the vast majority of ordinary Americans, it does coincide, and that is why you see tens of millions of people swirling around Bernie's message. And when we won in Seattle, everybody said, well, this is Seattle, we can win, maybe a socialist can win in Seattle. But Bernie is striking a chord in the heartland of America. This, I think, sisters and brothers, is a very, very important indication for us to take into mind. And we should see that there are many signs everywhere, locally and nationally. We have the CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union, that has mounted a valiant fight against Mayor 1% Rahm Emanuel. We're seeing victories here. We talked about the environmental victories, but I also want to give a shout out to the Space Needle workers who are here, the members of Unite Here Local 8, who are standing up against hypocrisy and saying that, we are union, we are workers, and we want our right to be respected. We have been on the picket lines together, and I'm really proud to say that, we have done that. But I think that is exactly what we need to do going forward. And remember that actually we can have some really exciting times ahead, but we need to fight for them.
Okay, David, do you want to do you have any thoughts about how this fight has played a role in the presidential election this year?
I think that I think that in progressive circles, we sometimes make the mistake of confusing political leaders for movement leaders. And FDR needed, for people who get the historical reference, a David Dubinsky, right? And LBJ needed needed a Martin Luther King, among other civil rights leaders, right? And so I think that I have, I guess, a few observations about the presidential race. One is, when the very first Republican debate on Fox News happened with what do they call it? There was the undercard and the main stage debate with all of the big kids. So the big kids table, the Republican debate. And on Fox News, right, not the working person's television network. Literally, because the average age demographic is like 75. The very first question was, there are fast food strikers outside our debate right now. What would you tell them about your willingness to raise the minimum wage to $15? Right? First question, first Republican debate of the presidential cycle. And so I think it's absolutely, overall I think I agree with Kshama, but it's absolutely true that the courage of workers standing up together, walking off the job, has totally changed the political discourse in this country about wages. Think about what was happening right before the Fight for 15, right? We were talking about Simpson bowls and debt ceilings and cleverly disguised attempts to cut Social Security and Medicare benefits for working America in the name of quote-unquote debt reduction, when America's debt as a percentage of GDP is at an all-time low, and something like debt service costs us 1.6% of our federal budget. Any household should be so lucky, right? But nevertheless, we were in this sort of trickle-down, Washington consensus, neoliberal discussion about how we could actually make ordinary working Americans and retirees tighten their belts even further. The courage of those first 200 workers in Brooklyn who walked off the job, and all of the many thousands of workers who have followed them, have given rise to a different moment in America where, not unlike, as you point out, the mayor's race here in 2013, no candidate can stand on any stage and fail to respond in some way to the demands of workers for $15.
All right. Well, Martina, I just wanted to end with one more question for you. You guys won. So what was it like for you? What has it meant for you to get the raise and to also have won that fight?
Well, amazing experience overall. And I actually don't work in fast food anymore. And so, but I do make over the minimum wage. But it was, I guess, a good experience for the few months that I did get it.
What are you doing now?
I do work at a retirement home, receptionist. But I do go back to my old job a lot and talk to workers, and they are saying it's a whole new group of people. Like, no one works there that worked there when I worked there, and they all have positive things to say about the new minimum wage that they do get. So no complaints so far from that job.
All right. Well, I think we are out of time, but David's book is for sale right over there, and I'm sure he will be around if you'd like to talk with him or any of the other panelists. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a good night.